Item D, receive report and provide direction to staff regarding a red light enforcement program.
This is a no-brainer.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and members of the Council. Previously, you've directed staff to review photo enforcement as a method to improve traffic safety in San Bruno. Staff conducted a request for proposal process and selected a photo enforcement vendor, which was Redflex. Redflex went out and did a preliminary evaluation of some of our major intersections, and at that time, Redflex advised that only one intersection, Sneath Lane and El Camino Real, showed a viability and a moderate number of violations. Redflex also cautioned that over 90% of the recorded offenses were right turn violations that may not be prosecutable depending on speed, vehicle position, and roadway configuration. Redflex advised that the results were a preliminary sample and that to do and conduct additional surveys, they would require us to enter into a contract. In June of 2009, City Council held a public hearing on the topic of red light photo enforcement and directed staff to negotiate a contract with Redflex in order to further examine the volume and frequency of violations at intersections in San Bruno. The contract agreement was reached, and in January, staff worked with Redflex to conduct additional survey work at 5 major intersections in San Bruno. The results of those additional survey work were received in March of this year. Redflex advised that of the 5 intersections surveyed, only one intersection, which was northbound El Camino at 380, showed viability based on a marginal number of violations where red light photo enforcement would reduce violations. A second intersection, San Bruno Avenue at Interstate 280, also showed a marginal number of possible violations in a 12-hour period. Should be noted that when we conducted and Redflex conducted their initial surveys, this intersection did not show any violations. Redflex added that because of the right turn violations and the configuration of the intersection making it difficult to install the photo enforcement equipment, they did not feel that this was a viable intersection. At the conclusion of the recent survey work from Redflex, Redflex advised that the city may not be able to recoup the operating costs from fines received from violations, and they recommended that the city defer installing any photo enforcement equipment at this time. Staff consulted with several local jurisdictions and learned that both San Carlos and Burlingame had net out-of-pocket expenses up to $3,000 per month when fines from violations did not cover their operating expenses for photo enforcement equipment. Per the contract with Redflex, monthly photo enforcement rental costs are $5,500 per month, and remember that's one camera per one approach at an intersection, and we estimated management of the photo enforcement program at about $2,000 a month. Based on the preliminary low number of violations provided by Redflex, fines from violations may not be able to cover our operating costs. If this is anything like our neighbors, we could face potentially $2,500 per month, and over a 3-year contract, that would result in an estimated $90,000 expense that was not budgeted for. Staff has concluded its review of photo enforcement at our major intersections, and at this point in time, we were recommending that we defer any installation of photo enforcement equipment. And that concludes my presentation, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Michael. Chair. Chief, at the intersections in question here, are there any recorded fatalities due to red light violations?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Or serious injuries?
There have been injury collisions at Sneath Lane in El Camino, at San Bruno Avenue in El Camino, and at 380 in El Camino.
Okay. Because it does seem like we're looking at this as from the revenue standpoint, and I think there's a public safety aspect to this as well. And looking at the costs, even over a 3-year period, if these cameras could eliminate the need for having another officer there watching traffic all day, it could still make financial sense. So I'm wondering if we weren't looking at it just from a financial aspect, would it make sense to have a camera there at one of these intersections?
Well, Councilmember Salazar, I think you're absolutely right. And this whole idea of photo enforcement is looked at with the idea of safety in mind. When we look at intersections and we first looked at this program, there were collisions at these intersections. I don't know that the number of those collisions were significant, but certainly safety is in mind. You're looking at an expense of what could possibly be $90,000 over a 3-year period, and I don't know that if that warrants or that expense would what that would equate to in terms of collision reduction.
Mm-hmm. It does seem that ideally, if you put up a camera, it will somehow, even just by its presence, reduce the number of accidents. So even if it was financially viable in the beginning, you put the camera up, people know there's a camera, they don't run it anymore, you don't issue any tickets. So over time, I imagine that revenue stream would go away anyway.
You're exactly correct. That's the idea of the program, and that you see on the initial installation of the photo enforcement equipment, you see a high number of violations. Those number of violations, depending on if it's transient traffic or residence traffic. Mm-hmm. If it's local resident traffic, you see that number of violations start to decline over time and then level out. And how some jurisdictions have chose to handle that is they move the camera to another intersection. There is a cost associated with moving that camera, but you're exactly correct. Also, red light and photo enforcement has shown that motorists who have that in their community tend to drive safer at other intersections, whether or not they're subject to photo enforcement.
Thank you.
To the chair, so in your view, there's not it may not be cost neutral? Is that maybe in the beginning it's good, and then you're saying where obviously we could end up like some other jurisdictions, they're not being able to pay for that through the fines?
Correct. And there will be a cost associated with that photo enforcement equipment.
Ben?
Just out of curiosity, I mean, what would the numbers have to be in the study for them to recommend to put the camera in? You know, say like on the Sneath Lane in El Camino. What would that?
I believe the numbers when Red Flex originally came out at our public hearing council meeting, I believe those numbers were in the 80s, and bear with me 1 second, I can get that.
So twice as much, more than twice as
Yes.
much as what?
I'm sorry, 64.
Still twice.
And that was a 12-hour period. Now, keep in mind that those that 64 number, 40% of those citations, or 40% of those recorded violations may not be violations.
Right. No, and I think we're all well aware of where the major cameras are in our communities, in our neighboring communities, and how before those cameras went up, what the violations were like. I mean, there was almost gridlock because people were running red lights. Now, now you see flash bulbs going all the time. So.
Anything else? Staffing. Michael?
Just a comment to the rest of the council. And this is just a report, and I know we're kind of discussing this, but I really think that the proper way to look at this would be at what benefit the light would provide, regardless of cost, whether it's cost neutral or not, because if there is a public safety benefit, then that should outweigh the cost. I don't think the cost is that outrageous. Actually, over 3 years, we're talking about probably less than the annual salary of a police officer if we needed to have somebody else out there. I know that then when there's a car parked on the street, a patrol car, people slow down. They notice that. If they know there's a camera, it'll be safer. In the absence of fatalities at these intersections, I don't know that there's a compelling reason to calm the traffic. If we were looking at this strictly as a revenue generator, then definitely it's not there. But I don't know what your thoughts are on.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. If you have the theoretically, I guess if you have the camera there, then you can save a big chunk of an officer actually being there too. And my guess is that these are going to bring in a lot of revenue at the very beginning, and then boy, people are going to get used to it and say, now it's not going to happen anymore because, you know, and that's where the cost comes in. I would just guess that a lot of the accidents that occur would probably occur whether there's a camera or not, just simply because people are that way. You know, if somebody's going to run a red light or something, I don't think it's going to make a whole lot of difference to them whether there's a camera taking a picture of them or not. So it's just my guess.
There does seem to be some benefit from having the speed radar signs. In certain neighborhoods. People do tend to slow down when they see those.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we could have a similar effect with that, if there is public safety need.
Chief, do you have a commander? Do you have a thought, recommendation, suggestion?
You know, at this time, we have one officer devoted solely to traffic. Our officers are assigned to patrol are handling call, and if they have any available free time, they are monitoring citizen complaint of areas where there's traffic violations and have minimal time to spend at all of our intersections. Our collision rates have been lower over the past few years. The commander's advising me that at El Camino and 380, he did a recent examination of that intersection, and there were no reported accidents within the last year. I would want to go back and revisit our statistics just to make sure of that fact, but there is a cost associated with that photo enforcement. I use the $90,000 figure, but keep in mind that it's $5,500 per camera per month and another $2,000 estimated in operation for that system. I think you should also be aware that there is certain talk at the state level against photo enforcement, while there's certain talk at the state level for expanding photo enforcement to include speed. So those are factors that are in the future and do impact this area.
And I appreciate that information, Chief. So do you have a recommendation as to whether you see this as something that this community should have?
I think that photo enforcement of any violation is a positive safety area that will improve traffic safety. I think the number of potential, and what you want to do, if you reduce the number of violations, you in theory reduce the number of collisions. I think our collision history, while there are some collisions at these locations, I don't know that they're significant enough to warrant that expense. And if we had a high number of collisions at a particular intersection and I couldn't enforce it with our officers because they're out handling other calls for service, I would recommend to you that yes, it would be worth that expense. I can't sit here tonight and tell you that there's one major intersection that is experiencing a significant number of collisions that would warrant a potential expense like this.
Thank you.
Well, this started out as an enterprising business. This is strictly this is a company looking at installing red light cameras. And we're looking at all the intersections that we have streetlights in and whether one fits. And I don't believe that it's money well spent. And I can appreciate my colleague wanting to say that you can't put a price on safety, but I think we can spend this type of money looking at other things in our community, like traffic calming and all that, and other things, and not just concentrating on the number of streetlights that we have. I believe, like you said, I think we may have other areas in our community that may have more severe traffic problems, not necessarily at these streetlights. So, I'm I don't think you need a motion or anything, but I'm not in favor of going forward with it.
Michael?
I think I agree with what Councilmember Ibarra is saying, because based on just the history at these intersections, it doesn't sound like there is a big public safety concern. And given that the state might take a different opinion on how these things are used, we should probably look at some other technologies that might be more beneficial.
Vice Mayor? Okay.
Let's put cameras at stop signs. That's what we-
Do not proceed with the installation. Got it? Thank you.